Well, thank you. Good afternoon. It's lovely to be back in Oxford, and I'm grateful that Andrew has rescheduled this session, for I was wondering how on earth I could compete with the World Cup as passionate as I am about my subject. The question that I would like to consider is, are historians equipped and able to establish the occurrence of a miracle? Historians face this problem in deciding what role reports of the miraculous should play in their narratives. This problem is also of interest particularly to the religionists and those in dialogue with them, for whom miracles are claimed in their distant historical traditions or even more recently. The issue of the capability of historians to consider the miraculous is by no means novel. For example, in modern times, in the face of the challenge of rationalism, among Protestants in the 19th century, there was a disengagement from history, as Alan Richardson put it. Haunted by G.E. Lessing supposing that the incidental truths of history can never become the proof of necessary truths of reason, Søren Kierkegaard insisted that faith did not depend on history, but on accepting the report of the basic absurdity that the eternal truth had entered history. In turn, and of particular interest to me, by the end of that century, the miraculous, though a significant part of the gospel accounts of Jesus, had been frozen out of the conversation for most students of Jesus and early Christianity. Writing on the historical Jesus in the early 20th century, Albert Schweitzer said that the exclusion of miracle from our view of history has been universally recognized as a principle of criticism, so that miracle no longer concerns the historian either positively or negatively. Instead, Jesus was expected to be recovered and understood through recovering his sayings. However, there was little agreement on which sayings reflected Jesus. Not until the time of Morton Smith's 1978 Jesus the Magician, in which the reported therapeutic activities of Jesus were taken seriously, was a thaw to be detected in interest in the miraculous. In more recent times, theological meteorologists could well report a global warming in the conversation in which the miraculous is increasingly visible in historical studies of Jesus and his early followers. Though rarely off the agenda, the resurrection, a supposed miracle of special interest to Christians, also appears to be attracting increased attention. Moreover, secular historians are once again grappling with the problem of the miraculous. For example, in recent years, a number of times, the miraculous has featured as a topic in the pages of History and Theory, the premier journal for the philosophy of history. It's not simply that religious historians are more conservative or that secular historians are more religious, though both propositions are likely demonstrable. Rather, in three ways, the climate has changed for historians. Broadly, first, the turbulence created by the postmodern turn has not only simply reduced confidence in historians producing definitive, or for some, any descriptions of the past. The postmodern turn has also provided space for realists, those who consider historical statements can describe actual events in the past, to reassert the credibility of their alternative narratives. More particularly, second, the early part of the 20th century saw the birth of the modern Pentecostal movement, and from the middle of the century, the Protestant and Catholic charismatic movements also became sociologically significant. This combined stream of global Christianity, characterized by its testimonies of the miraculous, along with increased readily available and very effective global communication, has confronted Western society and its thinkers, including historians, with the inescapable problem of miracle. Third, there is, as we'll see, an interest in what might be called emic history, fostered particularly by anthropologists in discovering rather than assessing or explaining the views of those who produce the artifacts of history. In order to concentrate on the question of whether or not historians are able to decide if the report of a miracle is reliable, much will be assumed or left aside in this paper. In particular, it will be assumed that God or a God exists and that this God can engage in special action in the world. Also, beyond the scope of this paper is the issue of how God might bring about a miracle. What is at stake in this paper is whether or not the historian is equipped to assess the truth of a report of that supposed action. But first, we must define our key term. We have many options and a great deal of help in defining miracle and its adjective miraculous. Augustine of Hippo took religious conversion to be a miracle. John Macquarie said that a miracle is an event that excites wonder. In his story of a train inexplicably stopping a few feet from a little boy stuck in the rail tracks riding his toy car, R.F. Holland famously defined a miracle as a coincidence. Although, as has been pointed out by David Bassinger, there's no agreed definition of miracle. It is not these rather soft definitions that challenge the historian. Rather, the historian is faced with profound problems when a report of an event is claimed to be miraculous, in that it involves any of three features. The report is of a rare or unique event. There are no apparent natural or including human causes. And the occurrence is supposed to be the result of a basic act of God or of direct supernatural action. As we attempt to make a case that historians may be justified in judging whether or not a reported event can be described as a miracle, we'll have to take into account the major challenges to historians involved in these three features. We begin with some broader challenges facing historians considering the miraculous, which, if successfully met, clear the ground for arguing that the historian can assess the historicity of a unique or a rare event brought about by special divine action. So the challenge of scientific atheism. An age-old conundrum was solved by Dame Veronica Wedgwood in declaring that history is an art, like all the other sciences. In any case, secular historians share with the scientific community the axiom that there is no room for God as an agent. In a 1968 essay on historical method in the study of religion, Morton Smith said that historians like the Epicureans may insist on the existence of gods, but must also, like them, deny that the gods intervene in the world. It is precisely this denial, Smith said, which is fundamental to sound historical method. It is, he goes on to say, of no concern to the historian whether or not supernatural beings exist. But, in his view, the historian does require a world in which natural phenomena are not interfered with by arbitrary and ad hoc divine interventions to produce abnormal, special historical consequences. Smith assumes that this is not a matter of personal preference, but of professional necessity. For he supposes that unless the possibility of God's special intervention is ruled out, there can be no calculation of most probable causes. There would always be an unknown probability that a deity might have intervened. To begin with, on the one hand, Smith's supposition that in denying the agency of a God he has ruled out uncertainty flies in the face of the nature of all knowledge. The history of the scientific enterprise is filled with the discoveries of the new and littered with spent theories of the old. And Ernst Troeltsch clarified for us that in the realm of history there are only judgments of probability. On the other hand, Smith is correct in his claim that the sciences function on the assumptions of a predictable universe. Indeed, as is generally recognised, historians share a number of assumptions with all who investigate the natural world. If a historian attempts to describe and explain a reported event in the past, a number of assumptions in their various forms are relied upon. It has to be assumed that the world exists and is independent of beliefs about it, that our perceptions of the world are able to provide true impressions of it, and that rules of inference lead to reliable knowledge of the world. Notably, it has to be assumed that the historian's experience of the natural world is the same as for those in the past reporting an event. Another assumption is that our knowledge of the world is incomplete, and that our knowledge has been and continues to be discovered, and new knowledge, I should say. Further, it is assumed that new knowledge is obtained through approaching the world with open or non-prejudged, specific questions and careful observation, rather than with fixed prejudices, and that old assumptions remain open to testing and revision. On its own principles, scientific inquiry cannot rule out the miraculous without first assuming that a God who can and wishes to intervene in the world does not exist. It must also be assumed that such intervention could not be detected, a point which we will explore in a moment. And it is not that the scientific method would collapse if such a God was proposed to exist and to cause miracles. For by definition, miracles are rare, and their possibility does not prevent the historian from carrying on business as usual, calculating the most probable explanation of the evidence being other than special divine interaction. Rather, the historian coming to the evidence with open, specific questions and careful observation would remain free to determine whether or not a reported event was miraculous, in that it was both rare and had no known natural, including supposed emergent causes, or was an invention, or an illusion, or a fable, or a myth, or a misunderstanding of natural causes. Well, on to the postmodern challenge. As is clear from Carl Becker's 1926 paper to the American Historical Association, or Sir George Clarke's 1957 introduction to the New Cambridge Modern History, there have long been suggestions that the craft of history is too subjective to narrate what actually happened. Becker supposed that the facts do not say anything, do not impose any meaning. It is the historian who speaks, who imposes meaning. And Sir George stated that there are no objective historical truths. Then somewhere in the last quarter of the 20th century, in an understanding of life and literature that came to be called postmodernism, there was a groundswell of opinion among some historians that threatened and threatens to undermine confidence in historical explanation and objectivity. For example, Hayden White, a key figure in postmodern historiography, supposing there is no essential distinction between fiction and history, put it that when it comes to the historical record, there are no grounds to be found in the record itself for preferring one way of construing its meaning rather than another. That is, instead of the past record imposing its reality on the historian, it is the historian's interpretation which assigns meaning and causality. On this approach, the historian's own subjectivity is taken to preclude reliable results. Whether or not a miracle took place or was reported is entirely determined by the subjective judgment of the historian. However, first, as critics of postmodern historiography are tireless in pointing out, if historians are limited by an all-encompassing subjectivity, making all historical knowledge relative, the position itself is self-refuting. More practically, second, while historians impose interpretations and posit causation, in themselves texts also carry and impose meaning through the absence or presence of words and through the recoverable ranges of meanings of those words. Similarly, in that a bone is not a brick and a piece of pottery is not the same as a strap of leather, artifacts come with at least some inherent limits on the range of their possible meanings. Third, while subjectivity may influence or even govern historians' interpretations of texts and artifacts, those judgments remain open to testing, challenging, and correcting by other historians. Though perfect objectivity and complete knowledge of the past may be impossible, the engagement of the community of historians on any one question reduces complete subjectivity and potentially increases the credibility or trustfulness of interpretations. If then, through its remains, the past speaks to the present, the historian can listen to and report on, perhaps, even the miraculous. Now on to emic history and the miraculous. Confessional history that privileges some religious traditions at the expense of others is rightly rejected by most historians. For example, in seeking to treat all traditions with greater impartiality, Reformation historians rely on the social sciences or humanities for their theories of religion. However, it's rightly argued that the result is not greater neutrality or objectivity. Instead, there's a different confessional history resulting in an equally biased account of the past. For what is imposed on the past are not particular religious beliefs, but particular secular beliefs. For example, Richard White, a past president of the Organization of American Historians, remarked, "I'm a historian. I don't believe in transcendence. There's only every day." The underlying assumption of this approach to history is that the past, including religious traditions, can only be explained in terms of human endeavour. As once put by Emil Durkheim, still influential in the social sciences, there is no science except science of natural phenomena. Religion can then be described in terms of a system of symbols that refer to nothing beyond the ideas, attitudes, judgments, longings, or belief served by the symbols. Brad Gregory of the University of Notre Dame, one of those who has drawn attention to this issue, points out that the assumption behind such remarks are not philosophically or theologically neutral. Rather, he asserts, they are theologically atheistic, metaphysically materialist, and culturally relativist, framed by the postulates of the natural sciences. More to the point for Gregory, this confessional secular history imposes undemonstrable metaphysical beliefs on the practice of scholarship. He makes this assumption on the basis that any conviction that precludes in principle the possibilities that transcendent spiritual reality exists, that divine revelation is possible, that divinely worked miracles occur or have occurred, cannot itself be demonstrated a posteriori, in our present or in any realistically foreseeable state of knowledge. In short, he says, it is an undemonstrable belief to hold that any religious claim that violates metaphysical naturalism must be false. Gregory's point is that when historians, taking into account religious claims, assume metaphysical naturalism or epistemological skepticism, a secular bias is involved, and historians are writing not unbiased history but secular confessional history. The miraculous is precluded or reduced to symbols, illusions, myths, or is supposed to be one of the means of social control. Gregory's solution is not to call for a resumption of traditional confessional history. Instead, he proposes historians adopt a post-confessional, non-reductionist approach. His point is that historians should not impose any metaphysical beliefs or moral judgments on the past, at least for the purpose of understanding the record. In this approach, which we might call emic, historians seek to bracket out their own beliefs in order to understand the past in its own terms. The leading question in this historical inquiry is, what did it mean to them? In studying the miracles attributed or related to Jesus, this approach is not uncommon. John P. Meyer, for example, does not think the historian as a historian can determine whether or not a miracle has taken place. Instead, he says, we can only hope to ascertain what Jesus, his followers, and sometimes his adversaries thought was the explanation of his startling deeds. It's immediately obvious that this approach to history avoids what E.P. Thompson called the enormous condescension of posterity. Emic history also avoids what could justly be called cultural or intellectual colonialism, in which the dominant historiography arrogantly rewrites the story of the past. As the sources dictate, this emic history is potentially able to bring the miraculous back into focus in a historical narrative. However, this approach respects neither the past actors nor the present inquirers. Indeed, few historians and their readers in whose traditions the miraculous appears to be a feature will be satisfied with the description of what the reports and artifacts meant to those who produced them. As we've already noted, axiomatic for the historian is the assumption that human experience of the natural world, even if understood and explained differently, has remained constant through time. Therefore, arguably, not only must the historian describe the past in its own terms, but if it is also to be understood, which is only possible in terms of the horizon of the historian, the past must also be explained. Reports must be analysed and assessed, and judgments must be passed. If the narrative describing the past is different from what could be expected in the present, it's not sufficient. Curiosity will not be satisfied. The explanation would not be complete to say, that was then, this is now. They thought differently. Part of describing and understanding the past involves assessing, and with due humility that respects those responsible for the records, passing judgment on ideas, practices, and reports. For example, if a text proposes the earth is flat or the centre of the universe, a description alone of those views falls short of the historian's responsibility to pass judgment on those ideas. For the primary concern of the historian is not to chronicle or describe, which is the dominant objective of what we are calling emic history, but to explain what happened in relation to what the historian knows about the world. In analysing, assessing, and passing judgment, our understanding of the past and potentially the present is changed and enriched. That is, if a description of the past is different, if, for example, it contains a report of the miraculous, we are obliged to ask if, from our perspective, they have invented or misunderstood something, or if we are missing or misunderstanding something in our perception of the world. In short, while an emic history may, with sympathy and humility, describe the past in its own terms, to understand the past, the historian is obliged also to explain, assess, and pass judgment on the past, for explanation and judgment is as much part of understanding history as dispassionate description. In other words, emic history ignores rather than faces the problem of the historian and the miraculous. So far, in facing these three challenges, the nature of the scientific method, the postmodern challenge, and the shortcomings of emic history, we have reached a point where we can engage with the more specific challenges of the rare or unique event and supposed supernatural intervention. So now to the challenge of the rare or unique event. An inherent feature of reports of the miraculous is not that they are all sui generis events. They may also be rare events. For example, reports of unaided spontaneous healing, such as of cancer, are deemed miraculous, not because they are unique, for there are many such reports. Rather, they are taken to be miraculous because they're at least relatively rare. If a reported event was common, even if its cause was not understood, it would, on past experience, not be thought miraculous, but assumed that natural causes would one day be discovered. The challenge for the historian is that it is generally agreed that the historical method rules out the rare and certainly the unique event. For fundamental to the historical method, which enables the historian to describe, assess, and understand reports and artifacts from the past, are two interrelated principles. One we've already noted more than once is the assumed consistency of human experience over time. In turn, out of this assumption arises the principle of analogy, which enables all historical assessment, reconstruction, and explanation. That is, the description of a past event, including its causes, is assessed in the light of analogues available to the historian. Without analogues, historians are vulnerable to the accusation of superstition. The principle of analogy has been variously expressed. In his essay on miracles, David Hume put it, "The maxim by which we commonly conduct ourselves in our reasonings is that the objects of which we have no experience resembles those of which we have." In Ernst Trauss' widely quoted essay, Historical and Dogmatic Method in Theology, he put it, "Agreement with normal, customary, or at least frequently attested happenings and conditions as we have experienced them, is the criterion of probability for all events that historical criticism can recognize as having actually or possibly happened." In other words, put sharply, if the historian has no experience of a reported event, that historian is unable to assess the report positively. Yet the application to historical inquiry of what Trauss calls the omnipotence of analogy does not imply or depend on the identity or similarity of all historical events. For no reported historical event finds an exact analogy in another time or place. Rather, through the lens of approximate contemporary analogies, the historian can hope to judge what appears to be typical and common. Therefore, provided the report is not of a unique event, the principle of analogy is useful to the historian. Moreover, the interpretation of historical data through analogues is more complex than comparing similar present-day narratives or artifacts with those of different times. Many particular or similar analogues may be required to understand and explain the report of a large, complex event. For example, as has been pointed out from time to time, there may have been no global analogy available to assess the historicity of the first human lunar landing. However, the various components or aspects of the reported landing and the causal connections between them have analogues that enable the historian to assess the historical veracity of reports of the overall event. Notwithstanding, the principle of analogy is open to considerable criticism. First, the principle can be used either positively or negatively. Used positively, the historian with approximate analogues for the elements and causal relationships in a narrative is able to consider concluding positively on the historicity of the event. Used negatively, however, the principle or tool is a blunt and unworkable instrument. For example, a European historian having no analogue for, say, black swans would once have judged a report involving such creatures to be mistaken. This negative, illegitimate use of analogy supposes there is no variation in time or place in what can or has occurred, and that the historian has access to analogues from all times and places. This leads to another problem with the principle of analogy. That is, second, as the principle is generally formulated and applied, the experiences of the historian are assumed to provide the necessary analogues for assessing the reported experiences of all reports of the various cultures of the past. This assumption is not simply an illustration of the fundamental subjectivity of the historical method. Rather, it exposes the error of assuming that the historian, who may be from a vastly different time or culture, is able to provide the whole range of analogues available and necessary to understand, assess, and explain the past. The problem is ameliorated somewhat by broadening the resource base for the principle. That is, rather than being restricted to their personal knowledge or experience, historians could appeal to the guild of historians, or to common experience, or even to the whole of history, thereby potentially increasing the range and reliability of analogues available. In relation to the problem of assessing the veracity of miracle reports in the New Testament, Craig Keener has gathered a great number of reports of contemporary miracles. His catalogue is enriched through containing reports not only of Western witnesses, but also from those in the majority world. even though, on Keener's own admission, not all his reports have been or could be subject to careful scrutiny, there is likely to be in his collection a considerable number of potentially valuable analogues for assessing reports in the New Testament and other times. At least for students of the New Testament, it is not that analogues of many of the miracles are unavailable, but a question of whether or not these analogues are permitted to inform the historian. Notwithstanding, the principle of analogy is powerless in contending with the unique. Nevertheless, in the face of a report of the unique, the historian has at least two options. First, there is Troeltsch's principle of correlation, which assumes that all events have causes and consequences. As he explains it, the concept implies that there can be no change at one point without some preceding and consequent change elsewhere, so that all historical happening is knit together in a permanent relationship of correlation. Although by definition a miracle has no preceding natural cause, the historian is able to assess the veracity of report by investigating the consequent effects of the supposed event. If the miraculous event took place in history, though brought about by divine action, it will leave traces in history. The classic appeal to this approach is among historians attempting to verify reports of Jesus' resurrection. James Dunn, for example, notes the before and after difference in the followers of Jesus. In contrast to their fear and cowering indoors before the resurrection, afterwards the disciples could not be intimidated by their opponents. Further, the initial spread of Christianity is part of this data. Something must have happened to them, Dunn supposes. There must be an adequate explanation for such an outcome. He says that the resurrection is part of that explanation. Second, in the face of the inability of the principle of analogy to help assess the report of a unique event, the historian is able to rely on testimony. Long ago, Hume set out the principle. In its positive form, he stated that testimony is sufficient to prove or establish the occurrence of a miracle if the testimony is of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the reported miracle. However, Hume assured his readers that on this principle no such miracle had or could ever be established. Hume's critics have been less confident. Keith Ward, for example, has made the point that if we have observed carefully, in good conditions, testimony will rationally outweigh expectations. Ward goes on to say that testimony is able to outweigh our expectations, for our expectations are themselves founded on testimony and on acceptance of thousands of reports from others. In other words, without access to analogy, the historian is able to rely on testimony, particularly its cumulative weight, in judging the veracity of the report of the miraculous. Well, the last major heading, the historian and supernatural agency. We obviously don't have to stop and worry about the score of the World Cup. It's one thing to argue, as we have, that on its own principle, scientific inquiry cannot rule out the special intervention of a God in history, and that the scientific method would not collapse if such interventions occurred. It's quite another thing to argue that the historian is able to determine whether or not that divine intervention has taken place. Indeed, it's common among biblical historians to deny their ability to determine whether or not a report involves special divine action and can be judged to be of a miracle. Meyer well represents those who assert that if historians, believers and atheists alike, are to function as historians, at least in the realm of academic history, all they can conclude in relation to the miraculous is that an extraordinary event did or did not take place. Meyer is confident that the historian is able to prove the claim false that God and God alone acted to accomplish an extraordinary event. Initial investigations may have overlooked, for example, some human action or unknown force, or fraud or trickery, delusion or psychiatric illness as rightly responsible for the claimed event. But even if all such explanations are excluded, Meyer maintains the historian cannot make the positive judgment that God has acted to bring about an extraordinary event. For Meyer wants to assert that the claim that God has directly acted to cause an event is not a historical but a theological judgment. That is, he says, the judgment that this particular event is a miracle accomplished by God necessarily moves the person making the judgment into the realm of philosophy or theology. Excuse me. However, in this approach, Meyer and those for whom he speaks misrepresents the intellectual endeavour. First, though some insist the historian's work is not open to scrutiny by others, no profession has secure borders or is self-sufficient. No profession is an island entire of itself. Every profession is a piece of the continent, a part of the main, as John Donne might have put it. Pragmatically, all professions rely on the resources and results of others, sometimes through borrowing or collaboration, sometimes through an interdisciplinary approach. The biologist on the statistician, and the astronomer on the engineer, and the historian on the archaeologist, anthropologist, philosopher, and theologian, for example. In turn, on the grounds of the unity of knowledge, the conclusions of any one profession are subject to the scrutiny by any other profession. The value of the judgments in any field, including history and theology, are dependent on the wide or general testing and acceptance not only by peers but by other professions. In other words, the historian is not working alone, but is dependent on the philosopher and theologian, for example, for resources and for the testing of conclusions. Second, Meyer fails to take into account a fundamental procedure in postulating and establishing new knowledge. That is, new knowledge is gained in a number of ways, for example, not only through direct observation or experience, but also through indirect information and inference. John Polkinghorne would remind the likes of Meyer that the existence and activity of subatomic particles have not and may never be observed. Also, the Big Bang was not witnessed by any human. Yet the existence of such objects and the occurrence of such events is readily accepted by scientists and much of the general public. This knowledge is agreed not on the basis of direct observation or experience, but on the basis of inference from indirect knowledge. In turn, God's activity, though not established through direct observation, may be inferred from historical data. Further, third, Meyer and his cohort misunderstand the nature of much of general scientific inquiry, including history. It is not that the historian has access to the past, but not to the causes of the reported events. The historian lacks access to all the past events as well as their causes. It is only the echoes of the past, heard in the extant artifacts and records, that are available to the historian. Just as the astronomer does not have direct, even visual access to stars, but relies on radio telescopes and radio waves, so the historian relies on inference from extant data to reconstruct reports of events and also their causes. Again, consistent with scientific inquiry, whether in relation to the mundane or the miraculous, historians are bound to rely on inference. In building a positive case for identifying an event as a basic act of God, it is not sufficient to say that the event is extremely unlikely to have occurred without special divine intervention. For as we've already noted, such events may have other, including unknown causes. Instead, in relation to a report of a miracle, the historian is able to infer an act of God in three ways. First, if the reported event occurred in or in relation to another religiously charged event, the miracle may have been the result of special divine action. For example, if a long-term, hitherto incurable illness was deemed cured during or soon after a prayer asking God for healing, it could be inferred that the miracle was the result of supernatural agency. Second, if the reported miracle, say of a spontaneous change in the health of a person, reflected the supposed character of a god, it could be inferred that the miraculous event was brought about by that god. For example, on the one hand, if the change of health contributed to the well-being of the person, one kind of god might be inferred. On the other hand, if the change in health was considered destructive, another kind of god might be deemed to have acted. Third, it could be concluded that special divine action was responsible for a supposed miracle if that miracle was consistent with other similar events that had already been established to be the result of an act of God. If, for example, if there existed broad and robust testimony of special divine action bringing about healings from a particular disease, the miracle in question could also be deemed the result of special divine action. Well, the heading we've all been waiting for, summary and conclusions. The question to be answered in this paper has been, is the historian able to establish the authenticity of a report of a miracle? We started out acknowledging that the historian is seen to face profound problems in assessing and explaining reports of rare or unique events, or those in which there are no apparent natural, including human causes, or those that are supposed to be the result of supernatural action. Then first, over against the broad assertion of some historians that the scientific method rules out the possibility of divine intervention, it was noted that on its own principles, scientific inquiry cannot rule out the miraculous without assuming that a God who can and wishes to intervene does not exist. Further, being rare, by definition, miracles do not undermine scientific inquiry. Second, in the face of the postmodern challenge that the historian's subjectivity rules out reliable results, it was noted that in themselves remains from the past inherently carry limits on their meaning. Third, the approach we called emic history, that rightly seeks to avoid imposing beliefs on the past, but understands the past in its own terms, was shown to be an unsatisfactory solution to the problem of miracle for the historian. To carry out their task, historians need to move beyond dispassionate description to assessing and explaining remnants of the past. If these three challenges are met, we are in a position to address the two major challenges faced by the historian in assessing reports of supposed miracles. That is, first, in the face of the challenge of the rare event for which the principle of analogy is of limited use, it was noted that many more analogues to the miraculous are available than are generally admitted. Also, even the authenticity of a report of a unique event can be established on the grounds of its consequence in history, including in testimony. Then second, a positive case for identifying supernatural agency can be made on the grounds that the event occurred in relation to a religiously charged event, such as prayer, appeared to reflect the character of a god, or was consistent with other events that had already been deemed the result of special divine action. If these arguments have been successful, the historian is well equipped and able to establish a miracle probably has or has not taken place. Indeed, only the historian is able to determine whether or not a miracle has taken place in history. What hinders historians in their discussion of the miraculous is not method or evidence, but the constraints placed on them by their patrons and formal or informal power structures to which historians pledge their allegiance. Secular historians are no less beholden to their guilds and societies than religious historians to theirs. Each in their own ways produces the results acceptable to the patrons. New work, including in relation to the miraculous, will be done by those able to free themselves from the shackles of their minders. Thank you.